Jake Martinez slouched in what passed for a chair in the advanced xenopsychology lecture hall, which looked like someone had designed furniture for creatures who clearly hadn't consulted humans about basic anatomy. His knees were somewhere near his ears, and he was pretty sure the glowing purple cushion was judging his posture. Around him, his classmates settled into their respective seating arrangements with the kind of graceful precision that made Jake feel like he'd wandered into the wrong evolutionary tree. Professor Veltar clicked into the room on 6 perfectly synchronized legs, her crystalline carapace catching the artificial sunlight in ways that probably violated several physics laws Jake hadn't learned yet. The Zentorian's voice resonated through the translation implant behind his ear, with all the warmth of a funeral director discussing payment plans. "Today, we will discuss the mind fog phenomenon," she announced, and Jake could swear the temperature in the room dropped 5 degrees. A consciousness-dampening field that has challenged the greatest minds across 17 civilizations for over 3 millennia. Jake took a swig from his thermos and immediately regretted it. The coffee had gone lukewarm, which was basically a crime against humanity in his book. He'd have to remember to bring the good insulated one tomorrow. Preeth, the mantis-like Vexgari sitting to his left, began vibrating with what Jake had learned was anxiety rather than an incoming molt, her compound eyes fixed on Professor Veltar with the kind of intensity reserved for watching horror movies or checking final exam grades. "The mortality rate," Professor Veltar continued with the casual tone of someone discussing weather, "remains at approximately 37% for untrained minds." "Mortality rate," Jake whispered to Preeth, who responded by vibrating faster. Hissed Zara from his right. The saurian scales had shifted to an annoyed shade of orange that clashed terribly with her academic robes. "Some of us actually want to graduate with our consciousness intact." Behind them, Nox flickered between visible and not visible in what Jake assumed was the energy being equivalent of nervous fidgeting. When corporeal, Nox resembled a sentient aurora with a superiority complex and a philosophy degree. "The mind fog," Professor Veltar was saying, "attacks the higher functions of consciousness, unraveling complex thought patterns and reducing even the most sophisticated minds to their base components. It is, quite literally, the universe's way of testing whether a species deserves to call itself intelligent." Jake raised his hand. "So it's like a Monday morning meeting, but deadly." The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as awkwardness concentrate. Professor Veltar's antennae twitched in what Jake had learned meant either deep thought or impending violence. "Mr. Martinez," she said slowly, "this is not one of your human comedy entertainment programs. The mind fog has humbled entire civilizations. The eternal scholars of Proxima spent 2 centuries developing meditation techniques just to survive a 15-minute exposure. The hive minds of Kepler require a full ceremonial preparation involving 47 distinct mental exercises." "Right," Jake nodded, taking another sip of his disappointing coffee. "So when do we do this thing? I've got interspecies communication at 3, and Professor Glork gets cranky when students show up late." Preeth made a sound like air escaping from a balloon. Zara's scales went from orange to a deep purple that probably meant she was questioning her life choices. Nox stopped flickering entirely, which Jake was pretty sure was the equivalent of fainting. "Tomorrow," Professor Veltar announced, "you will each face the mind fog in our specialized testing facility. I suggest you spend the evening in deep meditation, mental conditioning, and making peace with whatever deities your species acknowledges." As the class filed out, with all the enthusiasm of people heading to their own executions, Jake screwed the cap back on his thermos and shrugged. How hard could it be? He'd survived organic chemistry, 3 roommates who didn't understand the concept of dirty dishes, and his mother's attempts to set him up with a nice girl from accounting. A little consciousness-dampening fog was probably just Tuesday. The next morning, Jake arrived at the mind fog testing facility with a fresh thermos of coffee and what he considered a reasonable amount of optimism. The building itself looked like someone had crossed a meditation retreat with a maximum security prison, all flowing curves and ominous metal detectors. He was pretty sure the architecture was supposed to be calming, but it mostly reminded him of expensive dental offices. His classmates had gathered in the preparation chamber, and Jake had to admit they'd really committed to the whole facing certain doom aesthetic. Kreth had arrived wearing what appeared to be ceremonial meditation beads made from the shells of her ancestors, which was either deeply spiritual or deeply disturbing depending on your perspective on insect funeral practices. She was currently performing what looked like a complex prayer, involving all 4 of her arms and several clicking sounds Jake didn't want to translate. Zara had painted intricate patterns across her scales in what she'd explained was ancient Saurian-focused symbology, though Jake suspected it was basically the reptilian equivalent of putting on your lucky socks. Her tail kept switching nervously, and she'd been practicing breathing exercises that sounded like a broken air conditioner. Knox had been meditating since dawn, hovering 3 feet off the ground in a lotus position that would have been impressive if Jake hadn't seen him do it just to avoid walking across puddles. The energy being was currently cycling through colors like a malfunctioning Christmas light, which Jake had learned meant he was either achieving enlightenment or having an existential crisis, possibly both. "Mr. Martinez," Professor Veltar approached with the kind of expression usually reserved for watching students fail spectacularly. "I notice you appear to have done no mental preparation whatsoever." Jake looked down at himself. Jeans, university hoodie, thermos of coffee, and the kind of confidence that came from surviving 4 years of undergraduate physics labs. "I brushed my teeth," he offered. Professor Veltar's antennae drooped. The mind fog chamber contains a psychic field calibrated to test the absolute limits of consciousness itself. Civilizations have built temples to prepare for this challenge. The ascended monks of Tau Ceti spend lifetimes training just to approach the threshold. "Cool," Jake said, unscrewing his thermos cap and taking a sip. The coffee was still hot, which automatically made this a better morning than yesterday. "So, how long does this thing take? I've got quantum ethics after lunch, and I really can't afford to miss another class." Preeth stopped clicking and stared at him with the kind of horror usually reserved for watching natural disasters. Zyra's scales had gone completely white, which Jake was pretty sure meant she was either terrified or experiencing severe indigestion. Knox flickered so rapidly he was practically strobing. "The standard test," Professor Veltar said slowly, "lasts exactly 1 hour. Most species require extensive recovery time afterward. Some never fully regain their previous cognitive capacity." "Right, but is there a curve?" Jake asked, because honestly my previous cognitive capacity wasn't setting any records to begin with. Professor Veltar made a sound that the translation implant couldn't quite process, which probably meant she was either laughing or crying, possibly both. She gestured toward the chamber entrance, a doorway that seemed to absorb light and hope in equal measure. "Very well," she said. "Monsieur Martinez, since you appear so confident, you may proceed first." Jake shrugged and headed for the door, pausing only to take another sip of coffee. Behind him, his classmates watched with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents or reality TV shows. "See you guys in an hour," he called back. "Try not to plan my memorial service until you know for sure I'm dead. I hate being late to my own funeral." The door sealed behind him with a sound like the universe sighing in disappointment. Inside the mind fog chamber, Jake found himself in what looked like the world's most expensive sensory deprivation tank had a baby with a philosophy textbook. The walls pulsed with a soft, hypnotic light that probably cost more than his student loans, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with the kind of energy that made his teeth itch. "Okay," he said to the empty room. "This is either really advanced or someone's having a laugh at my expense." The mind fog hit like a wave of cotton balls soaked in existential dread. Jake felt it wash over him, probing at the edges of his consciousness with the subtlety of a telemarketer at dinner time. His thoughts began to feel sluggish, like trying to think through molasses, and for a moment, he wondered if this was what his philosophy professor felt like all the time. Then he took a sip of coffee, and suddenly the world made sense again. "Ha!" he said, watching the psychic energy swirl around him like frustrated smoke. "That's weird." Meanwhile, in the observation room, Professor Veltar watched her other students with growing alarm. Preeth had entered the chamber second, her ceremonial beads clicking with what she'd claimed was ancient protective rhythm. The clicking had lasted approximately 30 seconds, before descending into what sounded like a broken metronome having an anxiety attack. "By the Hive Mother's mandibles," Preeth was now muttering, her compound eyes rolling independently as she spoke in what the translation software identified as archaic Vexgari wedding songs, subcategory funeral dirges. Her forearms were moving in patterns that looked less like meditation and more like she was conducting an orchestra that existed only in her increasingly scrambled mind. "This is concerning," Professor Veltar noted, making frantic notes on her datapad. "She appears to be reverting to ancestral memory patterns." Zara had entered third, her confidence lasting exactly as long as it took for the mind fog to notice her elaborately painted scales. The ancient Saurian focus symbols began changing colors on their own, cycling through what appeared to be her species' entire emotional spectrum in fast forward. Her tail was now wrapped around her own neck in what was either an advanced defensive posture or an attempt at accidental suicide. "The patterns," Zara hissed, staring at her own arms in fascination and terror. They're singing the songs of the hunt that never ends, the prey that becomes predator, the circle that eats itself. Her pupils had dilated to the point where her eyes looked like black marbles, and she'd begun stalking something that existed only in her mind. Note to self, Professor Veltar muttered. Recommend therapy for Miss Zara after this is over. Knox had volunteered to go last, claiming that as an energy being, he possessed natural advantages over crude matter-based consciousness. This confidence had lasted until the mind fog began treating his carefully maintained corporeal form like a cosmic lava lamp. He was now flickering between dimensions so rapidly that looking at him was giving Professor Veltar a headache, occasionally solidifying long enough to deliver profound philosophical insights like, "The spoon is the universe, but the universe is not a spoon," before disappearing entirely for 30 seconds at a time. "I am becoming one with the cosmic coffee pot," Knox announced during one of his brief moments of visibility, "and it is teaching me the true meaning of breakfast." Professor Veltar looked at her chronometer. They were 20 minutes into what should have been a disaster for all 4 students. Instead, she had one student speaking in ancient funeral songs, one experiencing what appeared to be a predatory hallucination, one achieving enlightenment through kitchen appliances, and one human who had just asked the monitoring system if there was a thermostat because it was getting a bit chilly. "Mr. Martinez," she spoke through the intercom, "how are you feeling?" Jake looked up at the ceiling speakers, took another sip of coffee, and shrugged. "Pretty good, actually. This is way less stressful than my macroeconomics midterm." "Hey, quick question, though. Are we supposed to be solving something in here? Because there's this weird floating puzzle thing, and I think I might have accidentally solved it while I was trying to figure out why my coffee tastes better when I'm being psychically attacked." Professor Veltar stared at her instruments in disbelief. According to every sensor in the facility, Jake Martinez was not only unaffected by the mind fog, he was actively thriving in it. His brainwave patterns showed the kind of steady, focused activity usually associated with deep meditation or really good caffeine highs. Meanwhile, Kreeth had begun weaving what appeared to be a cocoon out of thin air. Zara was now convinced she was hunting the concept of mathematics, and Knox had achieved such complete enlightenment that he'd forgotten how to maintain physical form entirely. "This is impossible," Professor Veltar whispered, watching Jake casually work his way through a series of psychic puzzles that had stumped graduate students for decades. The mind fog should be attacking his consciousness directly. How is he not only surviving but solving advanced problems? Jake, oblivious to the academic crisis unfolding in the observation room, finished what he was pretty sure was a 3-dimensional pseudo-puzzle made of pure thought and checked his watch. 35 minutes to go and his coffee was still hot. All things considered, this was turning out to be a pretty decent Tuesday. It was around the 40-minute mark when Jake started to put the pieces together, which was impressive considering he'd originally thought the floating geometric shapes were just very aggressive screensavers. He'd solved what appeared to be 17 different psychic puzzles, rearranged a constellation that existed only in mathematical theory, and somehow taught a sentient equation the concept of jazz, all while maintaining what he considered a perfectly reasonable caffeine buzz. The mind fog itself had begun behaving less like a consciousness-dampening field and more like a confused puppy. It would swirl around him aggressively for a few seconds, then seem to give up and drift away to bother the abstract concepts floating in the corners of the chamber. Jake was starting to feel a little sorry for it. "Okay, I think I'm starting to get what's happening here," he announced to the room, taking another sip from his thermos. Through the observation window, he could see Professor Veltar frantically taking notes while his classmates continued their respective journeys into madness. Kreeth had completed her air cocoon and was now humming what sounded like the Vexhari equivalent of show tunes. Zara had cornered the concept of Tuesday and was lecturing it about proper hunting etiquette. Knox had temporarily stabilized into the shape of a philosophical question mark. "Professor Veltar," Jake called through the intercom, "I think your mind fog thingy is broken. It's like it's trying really hard to scramble my brain, but it keeps bouncing off." Professor Veltar's voice crackled through the speakers with barely contained academic hysteria. "Mr. Martinez, the mind fog is functioning exactly as designed. It targets the higher consciousness patterns of advanced civilizations. The more sophisticated the neural pathways, the more devastating the effect." Jake nodded thoughtfully, swirling his coffee like a sommelier contemplating a particularly complex vintage. "Right, so it's designed to attack smart brains." "Precisely. The most elegant, evolved, and refined mental processes are the most vulnerable to—" "Oh," Jake interrupted, a grin spreading across his face. "Oh, that's hilarious. Professor, I think I know what your problem is. There was a pause that could have been measured in geological epochs. I beg your pardon? Your super-advanced consciousness melting weapon is like a really expensive computer virus, Jake explained, gesturing with his thermos in a way that made Professor Veltar nervous about potential spills. It's designed to target sophisticated operating systems, high-end stuff, top-of-the-line neural networks with all the bells and whistles. Yes, that is correct. The mind fog represents the ultimate test of mental evolution But human brains are basically running on coffee and spite, Jake continued cheerfully. We're not sophisticated. We're the mental equivalent of that old computer in your basement that somehow still works even though it should have died 15 years ago. The virus keeps trying to attack our advanced processes, but joke's on everyone, we don't have any. The silence from the observation room was deafening. Jake could practically hear Professor Veltar's worldview crumbling. Furthermore, Jake added, warming to his theme, I'm not just running on standard human brain power here. I'm running on caffeinated human brain power. You know what caffeine does to humans, right? It doesn't make us smarter. It just makes us think we're smarter while operating at maximum stubborn efficiency. Your mind fog is designed to dampen consciousness. But caffeine doesn't elevate consciousness, it just makes whatever consciousness we have really, really persistent. Professor Veltar made a sound that the translation software couldn't process, which was either deep thought or the alien equivalent of screaming into a pillow. So, Jake continued, while everyone else's beautiful, elegant, highly evolved brains are getting scrambled like Sunday morning eggs, my primitive, caffeine-addled human brain is just sitting here going, neat puzzles. I wonder what happens if I poke this glowy thing and accidentally solving problems that have stumped civilizations for millennia. He took another sip of coffee and surveyed the chamber with the satisfaction of someone who'd just figured out why the printer wasn't working. Want me to test my theory? How? Professor Veltar asked weakly. Jake held up his thermos. Got any more cups? 20 minutes later, Jake stood outside the chamber with Professor Veltar, watching through the observation window as his classmates experienced what could only be described as the galaxy's most expensive caffeine intervention. He'd managed to get small amounts of coffee to each of them through the chamber's emergency supply port, which was apparently designed for delivering life-saving medications, but worked just fine for delivering life-saving stimulants. Preeth had been the first to recover, emerging from her cocoon with the shell-shocked expression of someone who just remembered they had bills to pay. The ancestors, she said slowly, were singing about quarterly tax assessments. Zyra's scales had returned to their normal green, though she was still occasionally glancing suspiciously at corners where she'd been hunting abstract concepts. I nearly caught the mathematical representation of fear, she muttered. It tasted like Tuesday. Knox had stabilized into his normal humanoid aurora form, though he kept flickering slightly whenever he tried to think about his enlightenment experience. I achieved perfect understanding of the universe, he announced sadly. And then I forgot it when I remembered how much I hate the taste of coffee. Professor Veltar stared at her instruments, which now showed 4 students with perfectly normal, if slightly jittery brain activity patterns. This is impossible. You've just solved a mystery that has plagued xenopsychology for 3 millennia with gas station coffee. Actually, Jake corrected, checking the label on his thermos. This is premium dark roast from that little place downtown. But yeah, basically. He paused, considering. You know, this probably explains why humans are so weird compared to everyone else. Every other species evolved sophisticated consciousness, and we just evolved the ability to stay awake long enough to be annoying. Professor Veltar's antennae drooped as the full implications of Jake's discovery began to sink in. Somewhere in the distance, she could already hear the sound of her carefully constructed academic reputation crumbling like a cookie in coffee. Word spread through Galactic University with the kind of speed usually reserved for gossip about professors sleeping with their teaching assistants, or news that the cafeteria was serving actual food instead of nutritionally optimized paste. By the time Jake made it to his quantum ethics class, he found Professor Glork standing outside the lecture hall with what appeared to be the entire xenopsychology department, 3 journalists from the Galactic Academic Review, and someone who looked suspiciously like the Dean of Interdisciplinary Studies. Mr. Martinez, Professor Glork gurgled through his translation implant, his gas-giant physiology making him sound like he was gargling with helium. Is it true that you solved the mind fog problem with coffee? Jake shifted his backpack and checked his thermos level. Still half full, which was good because this was shaping up to be one of those days. I mean, I wouldn't say I solved it. I just figured out why it wasn't working on me. Like when you can't get your computer to crash because you're still running Windows 95. The crowd erupted in what Jake was beginning to recognize as the academic equivalent of a feeding frenzy. Tablet computers appeared from nowhere, recording devices began humming, and someone started taking pictures of his thermos like it was the holy grail of higher education. Dr. Whistlethorpe, the elderly crystal white from advanced theoretical consciousness, pushed through the crowd with the kind of urgency usually reserved for fire drills or final exams. His translucent body was cycling through colors that Jake had learned meant either extreme excitement or impending cardiac event. "Young human," Dr. Whistlethorpe chimed, his voice like wind through crystal caves. "Do you realize what you've accomplished? The mind fog has been the ultimate test of consciousness for over 3,000 years. Entire civilizations have built their educational systems around it. The ascended philosophers of Centauri Prime have 17 different doctoral programs dedicated to mind fog resistance techniques." "Cool," Jake said, taking a sip of coffee and immediately regretting it, as the crowd made collective notes about his consumption patterns. "So, is this going to be on the final exam? Because I really need to know what I should be studying." Professor Veltar appeared at his elbow, with the expression of someone who'd spent the last 2 hours explaining to increasingly hysterical colleagues that, yes, the human had really solved their greatest academic mystery with a beverage. "Mr. Martinez," she said carefully, "the Galactic Research Council would like to examine your thermos." Jake clutched his coffee protectively. "They can look at it, but I'm not letting anyone else drink from it. Do you know how many germs you can pick up from a crystalline? No offense, Dr. Whistlethorpe." "None taken," Dr. Whistlethorpe chimed cheerfully. "We don't actually have germs in the traditional sense. Our pathogenic equivalents are more conceptual in nature." "See, that's even worse," Jake pointed out. "I don't want to catch a conceptual disease. What if I got infected with the idea of being sick? That sounds way worse than regular sick." Dr. Zephyra, the department head of comparative consciousness studies, floated over on what Jake assumed were anti-gravity generators, but might have been sheer academic indignation. Her species looked like someone had crossed a jellyfish with a philosophy textbook, and she pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that his translation implant assured him meant profound intellectual disturbance. "Mr. Martinez," she said in a voice like cosmic wind chimes having an existential crisis, "we need to understand the mechanism by which caffeine neutralizes psychic dampening fields. This could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness itself." "Or," Jake suggested, "and hear me out on this, maybe consciousness is just way less complicated than you guys think it is. Maybe the reason your super advanced test doesn't work on humans is because we're not actually that advanced. Maybe we're just really, really good at being stubborn while caffeinated." The silence that followed this suggestion was the kind of quiet usually found in libraries, morgues, or moments before academic riots. Jake could practically see the collective worldview of several species undergoing rapid and traumatic revision. "But," Dr. Whistlethorpe said slowly, "that would mean that the entire field of advanced consciousness theory is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how intelligence actually works." "Yeah, probably," Jake agreed cheerfully. "I mean, you guys have been trying to solve this thing with meditation and ancient wisdom and philosophical preparation, right? But you never tried just ignoring it really hard while drinking something that makes you jittery. That's like human problem-solving 101. Professor Veltar made a note on her datapad that looked suspiciously like Revi's entire curriculum. "Furthermore," Jake continued, warming to his theme and his audience, "I bet this isn't the only thing like this. How many other galactic mysteries are just sitting there waiting for someone to show up with the wrong approach and accidentally solve them? Maybe dark matter is just the universe's way of saying it needs more coffee. Maybe faster-than-light travel is impossible because everyone's trying to be elegant about it instead of just duct-taping a rocket to a shopping cart and seeing what happens." The crowd was now taking notes so frantically that Jake worried some of them might strain something. He noticed that several professors had started eyeing his thermos with the kind of intense scientific interest usually reserved for newly discovered elements or really good parking spaces. "I have a proposal," Dr. Zephyr announced, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to what Jake hoped was brilliant idea rather than preparation for ritual sacrifice. "Mr. Martinez, how would you feel about establishing the first human-run research laboratory dedicated to applied primitive problem-solving?" Jake considered this while taking another sip of coffee. "Would I get to set my own hours? Because I don't really function before 10 a.m., and that's with chemical assistance." "We could arrange for a flexible schedule," Professor Veltar said quickly, making more notes, "and perhaps we could discuss providing you with a research budget for coffee procurement." "Now you're talking," Jake grinned. "But I get to name it. I'm thinking something like the Institute for Solving Complex Problems Through Simple Stubbornness and Caffeine, or maybe just the Department of Human Common Sense. That has a nice ring to it. As the crowd began discussing the logistics of establishing an entirely new academic discipline based on Jake's accidental discoveries, he finished his coffee and checked his watch. He was already 20 minutes late for quantum ethics, and Professor Glork looked like he was developing some sort of academic crush, which was both flattering and mildly terrifying. "Hey," Jake called to the assembled scholars, "this is all great, but can we figure out the world-changing implications of human stupidity after lunch? I've got classes to attend, and someone promised me that quantum ethics was going to explain why it's morally wrong to time travel backwards to ace your own midterm." As he walked away, Jake could hear the excited chatter of dozens of academics, suddenly realizing that their carefully constructed theories might need some serious revision. Somewhere behind him, someone was already drafting a paper titled "Consciousness Dampening Fields, a 3,000-year overcomplication of basic neural chemistry." He made a mental note to ask for co-author credit on that one. 3 months later, Jake stood in front of a lecture hall that had been hastily converted from what used to be the Department of Advanced Theoretical Meditation. The old crystal formations and floating cushions had been replaced with what he'd specifically requested: normal chairs, a coffee machine that could serve 17 different species, and a whiteboard that didn't try to achieve enlightenment every time someone wrote on it. The sign outside read "Institute for Applied Human Problem Solving" in 12 different languages, though Jake still preferred his original name. Below that, in smaller text that he'd insisted on adding, it said, "Where simple solutions meet complex problems and everyone gets confused." His first official presentation, Caffeine-Based Solutions to Cosmic Problems, a practical guide to accidental genius, had attracted what appeared to be half the galaxy's academic community. The auditorium was packed with representatives from civilizations Jake couldn't pronounce, all furiously taking notes as he explained his revolutionary methodology. "The key," Jake was saying, clicking through slides he'd put together the night before with the kind of confidence that came from 3 cups of coffee and the certain knowledge that he was probably making most of this up, "is to approach cosmic mysteries with the same energy you'd use to fix a broken toaster. Don't overthink it, don't prepare for 17 years, and definitely don't assume that because something is ancient and mysterious, it requires an ancient and mysterious solution." Dr. Whistlethorpe, now Jake's self-appointed research partner, chimed his agreement from the front row. The crystalline had become something of a caffeine evangelist after Jake had introduced him to espresso, though his species processed it more like a mild hallucinogen. "The human approach has yielded remarkable results," he announced to the crowd. "In just 12 weeks, we've solved the paradox of infinite recursive consciousness, figured out why dark energy keeps filing noise complaints, and discovered that the great filter is actually just really bad customer service." Jake nodded, taking a sip from his presentation thermos, which had been specially designed by the engineering department and could maintain perfect brewing temperature for up to 6 hours. "Right, and that last one wasn't even hard. Turns out most civilizations give up on advancing when they can't get anyone on the phone to explain how hyperspace licensing works." In the audience, Professor Veltar was documenting everything with the dedication of someone whose career had been unexpectedly saved by embracing chaos. Her initial paper, "The Martinez Effect: How Primitive Stubbornness Revolutionized Consciousness Studies," had become the most downloaded academic article in galactic history, mostly because the title alone made people curious enough to check if it was a joke. "Now," Jake continued, "I know what you're thinking. How can we apply human problem-solving techniques to challenges that have stumped advanced civilizations? The answer is simple. Stop assuming they're advanced challenges. Most cosmic mysteries are just engineering problems with really good marketing." He clicked to his next slide, which showed a before and after comparison of the university's approach to unsolvable problems. The before image was a complex flowchart involving meditation, ancient wisdom, and 17 different committees. The after image was just a stick figure drinking coffee, next to the words, "Try poking it." "For example," Jake said, "the time loop paradox that's been trapping the civilization in Sector 7 for the last 1,000 years? Turns out they just needed to update their calendar software. The sentient nebula that keeps eating spaceships? It was lonely and wanted someone to talk to. The infinite maze of sorrows that drives explorers insane. The exit was marked employees only, so nobody thought they were allowed to use it." The crowd erupted, and what Jake had learned was the academic equivalent of applause, though it sounded more like a combination of clicking, humming, and one species that expressed approval by changing the ambient temperature. Preeth, now serving as Jake's unofficial teaching assistant after discovering she had a talent for translating human common sense into academic language, raised one of her 4 arms. "Professor Martinez, How do we institutionalize this approach without losing its essential randomness? Jake considered this, which mostly involved staring at the ceiling while drinking coffee until inspiration struck. Easy. We don't institutionalize it. The moment you make human problem-solving into a formal system, it stops being human problem-solving and becomes just another bureaucracy. The whole point is that we don't know what we're doing, so we just try stuff until something works. But, Dr. Zephyro pulsed from the back row, how do we teach this methodology to other species? You don't, Jake replied cheerfully. You just give them coffee and wait for them to get impatient enough to start ignoring the rules. Works every time. As the presentation wound down, and the crowd began filing out with the kind of excited chatter that meant someone's worldview had been productively demolished, Jake's personal communicator chimed with an incoming call. The display showed an identifier he'd been half expecting and half dreading. Galactic Council, high priority. Please don't ignore this one. Jake Martinez, he answered, because after 3 months of accidental fame, he'd learned that trying to pretend he wasn't available never worked. Mr. Martinez, came a voice that sounded like it was being filtered through several layers of bureaucratic importance. This is Chancellor Vorthak of the Galactic Council. We need to discuss humanity's application for advanced civilization status. Jake nearly choked on his coffee. Our what now? Your species submitted an application for reclassification from emerging primitive to advanced civilization approximately 18 months ago. The application has been under review pending demonstration of sufficient intellectual and cultural development. Right, Jake said slowly. And you're calling me because... Because, Chancellor Vorthak continued with the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow, your recent contributions to galactic problem-solving have been noted by our review committee. The Martinez Institute's success rate for solving previously unsolvable problems is currently running at 93%, which is higher than most advanced civilizations achieve on problems they've been working on for less than a century. Jake looked around the now empty auditorium, at the coffee-stained whiteboard covered with solutions to cosmic mysteries, at his thermos that had accidentally become the most studied object in xenoarchaeology. So, what you're saying is, humanity might get promoted to advanced civilization because I figured out that most galactic problems are just really complicated ways of saying, have you tried turning it off and on again? That is surprisingly accurate, Chancellor Vorthak admitted. However, there is one final requirement for advanced civilization status. Your species must demonstrate the ability to handle complex diplomatic situations with appropriate wisdom and maturity. Jake checked his watch. It was almost 2 p.m., which meant his caffeine levels were approaching the danger zone, where he started making decisions that future Jake would have to live with. When do you need an answer? We're prepared to conduct the evaluation immediately, if you're available. Can we do it after lunch? Jake asked. I haven't had my 3rd cup yet, and I'm pretty sure I make better diplomatic decisions when I'm properly caffeinated. There was a pause that stretched across several star systems. Finally, Chancellor Vorthak's voice returned, tinged with what might have been amusement. Mr. Martinez, you just passed the test. I did? Any species wise enough to know they shouldn't make important decisions while under-caffeinated is clearly ready for advanced civilization status. Congratulations, humanity is now officially classified as an advanced species. Jake stared at his thermos, which stared back with the smug satisfaction of an inanimate object that had accidentally conquered the galaxy. Does this come with any benefits, like better parking or access to the good cafeteria? Mr. Martinez, Chancellor Vorthak said, and Jake could swear he heard the cosmic equivalent of a chuckle. Something tells me your species is going to do just fine in the galactic community. As Jake hung up and headed toward the faculty lounge for that crucial 3rd cup of coffee, he reflected on the weird turn his life had taken. 6 months ago, he'd been a struggling xenobiology student who couldn't figure out why alien furniture hated him. Now he was apparently the accidental architect of humanity's promotion to cosmic significance, all because he'd refused to take a test seriously without proper chemical fortification. He pushed open the door to the faculty lounge, where Professor Veltar was waiting with a pot of fresh coffee and what looked suspiciously like a celebration cake. I heard, she said, her antennae twitching with what he'd learned was Zentorian amusement. Congratulations on making your entire species officially smarter than they thought they were. Jake poured himself a cup and raised it in a toast. Here's to humanity, he said. We may not be the brightest species in the galaxy, but we're definitely the most caffeinated. Outside the window the stars seemed to twinkle with approval, though that might just have been the coffee talking.